The silver wastes burned yellow, a sheet of hammered brass under the late summer sun. It was a land that had forgotten the color green, if it had ever known it. The wind, when it came, offered no relief. It was just the earth's hot breath. Carrying alkali dust that tasted of ending, it hissed through the sparse, dead brush and tore at the sign of the Dry Comet trading post, which listed on one hinge. Its painted letters flaked away to silvered, splintered wood. The sound was a high-pitched keen, the only music in this emptiness. Behind the barred window of the post's main building, a structure that was half fortress and half junk pile, stood a woman. Her name was Maeve Calder. She was bound, not with iron, but with thick, new hemp rope that chafed her wrists raw. Red dust, the color of a fresh wound, was caked in the lines of her palms and settled high on her cheekbones. But it could not dull the fire in her eyes. They were fixed on a point just beyond the men who surrounded her, a look that was not defiant so much as it was utterly, terrifyingly resolved. She held her chin high, a posture that refused to acknowledge the rope or the bars. A cluster of surly riders, men whose faces were as cracked and dry as the land, lounged on the porch and leaned against the hitching rails. They passed a canteen, their laughter coarse and infrequent. Presiding over them from the top step was Orson Pike, the proprietor. He was a large man, soft in the middle, with a sweat-stained shirt that clung to his bulk. His beard was a tangle of gray and tobacco juice. He cleared his throat, a wet, rattling sound, and gestured with a proprietorial thumb toward the window. "Gents," he boomed, his voice a gravel slide. "A rare item for consideration, found adrift, you might say, with no claim and no papers." He was selling her, not as a slave, that was a word for another time, another place, but as something less. A fine to be paid, a debt to be collected by anyone willing to put down the coin. He was selling her as property, a piece of salvage washed up at his door. The woman behind the bars did not look at him. She did not look at the leering faces of the riders. Her gaze remained fixed on the horizon, on the shimmering line where the brass sky met the brass earth. Then she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it sliced through the heat and the lazy talk. It carried over the wind's constant whine. "I'd rather die." 5 words, each one a chip of ice, each one an anchor. The men shifted. A laugh was cut short. The statement was not a plea. It was not a threat. It was a simple declaration of fact, delivered with the finality of a judge's gavel. It was into this tableau of quiet menace that Holden Vance rode. He was not looking for trouble. He was simply looking for water. His horse, a sturdy bay mare, was lathered from the long ride from Larkspur Crossing, and his own throat was caked with the same red dust that adorned Maeve Calder. He was a man who owned a horse ranch, a man who understood the value of good water and solid ground, and the Dry Comet was the only water for 50 miles. He swung down from the saddle, his movements economical and weary, his eyes on the horse trough. He led the mare forward, letting her drink, before he untied his own canteen. He saw the cluster of men, noted the tension, and marked it as trouble to be avoided. He was just a traveler passing through. Then he saw her. He saw the shadow behind the bars. And then the woman came into focus. He watched as Orson Pike, irritated by the interruption, spat a stream of brown juice into the dust. "This here is a legal matter," Pike announced to the crowd, though he was looking at Holden, the newcomer. "This is a prisoner. Found her trespassing on railroad land. Suspected of arson. Got the warrant right here." Pike nodded to his right-hand man, Caleb Rourke. Rourke was a leaner, meaner shadow of his boss, a man who looked like he'd been carved from bad wood. He stepped forward, relishing the moment of authority. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his vest pocket. It was already dark with sweat. He unfolded it, holding it up for all to see, though no one was close enough to read it. "Signed and sealed," Rourke said, his voice a low growl. "From Ash Hollow County. She's to be held, and her assets seized to pay for the damages. Seeing as she has no assets, he grinned, revealing a gap where a tooth should have been. The fine must be paid by other means. Holden's eyes narrowed. He knew Ash Hollow County. He knew the seal, and the one Rourke held up, even from 15 paces. Looked wrong. The ink was too new, the stamp too faint, the placement clumsy. It was a forgery, and a bad one. The whole thing stank, a sour, pungent smell of deceit that reminded Holden of burning pine pitch, the kind you use to cover something rotten. This was not justice. This was a shakedown, a prisoner auction dressed up in the thinnest rags of legality. He looked back at the woman. Maeve. It was not her beauty that struck him, though she possessed a stark, wind-scoured fairness. It was her stillness. He had seen that look before. He'd seen it in a Mustang trapped in a box canyon, gathering itself for a final, impossible leap. He'd seen it in the eyes of settlers who had faced down a winter that should have killed them, emerging into the spring thaw with a piece of their soul turned to iron. It was the absolute refusal to be broken. It was the posture of a survivor. "So," Pike said, rubbing his hands together, his good humor restored. "What's the bidding for this? Fine. Shall we start at, say, $20, a small price to pay for such a spirited companion?" A few of the riders laughed. One man near the back, a prospector with haunted eyes, shook his head and turned away, shuffling back toward his mule. He wanted no part of this. But the others remained. Their interest piqued. This was sport. "I'll give you 10, called a freight driver, his voice thick with boredom. $10, and she can ride with the cargo." 10, Pike scoffed. "For a creature like this, look at that fire. Man, she's worth 50, at least." No one offered 50. No one offered 20. The bidding stalled. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind and the soft slurp of Holden's horse at the trough. The heat was relentless. Maeve Calder remained perfectly still. She had not reacted to the insultingly low offer. She had not reacted to Pike's salesmanship. She was a stone. Holden finished filling his canteen. He screwed the cap on, his knuckles white. He could get on his horse. He could ride away. Larkspur Crossing was another day's ride, and he had business there. This was not his fight. He had seen the brand of justice dispensed in these ungoverned territories before. To intervene was to invite a bullet. To stand against Pike and Rourke and their half-dozen armed men was suicide. Pike sensed the crowd's waning interest. He scowled, his gaze falling on the woman with a new malice. He stalked over to the window and slammed the heavy wooden shutter closed, plunging her into darkness. Then he dropped the thick iron bar that locked it from the outside. The sound of the bar hitting the brackets was a flat, final thud. "Fine," Pike snarled at the remaining men. "Be cheap. Let her bake. By afternoon, when the heat in that box gets right, the price will be cheaper than salt, and she'll be a good deal more agreeable." He laughed, that same scraping, humorless sound. The other men chuckled and began to disperse, finding shade under the porch awning to wait. The show was over for now, but the promise of a climax remained. Holden Vance stood alone by the trough, his horse now standing hip-shot and patient. He did not move. He felt the weight of the sun on his shoulders, a physical, pressing load. He could still hear the woman's voice. "I'd rather die." He ran a hand over the warm leather of his saddle horn, the material soft and familiar under his calloused palm. He did not know this woman. He did not know her crime, real or imagined. He knew nothing except the look in her eyes and the rank smell of the lie Rourke had held in his hand. He didn't know how he would do it. He didn't know if it was bravery or stupidity that kept his boots planted in the dust. He only knew, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in his gut, that if he swung into that saddle and rode away, if he left her to be cheaper than salt by afternoon, he would not sleep tonight. He would not sleep for a long time. And the man who owned the ranch at Larkspur Crossing would be a man he no longer recognized. Holden Vance did not remount. He let his reins trail in the dust, a silent, unread signal to his mare that they were not leaving. He pushed his hat back an infinitesimal fraction, his eyes moving, not with the quick, darting motions of a cornered man, but with the slow, deliberate assessment of a carpenter judging unsound timber. He took a step toward the porch, his boots crunching in the silence left by Pike's pronouncement. The proprietor, Orson Pike, turned, his bulk shifting, surprised by the new interest. The other men, who had been settling in for a long, hot wait, also looked up. "You said $20. Holden's voice was even, almost casual. It was a fine voice for trading horses. Seems steep for a prisoner you're just meant to be holding. A man might think you're trying to turn a profit." Pike's eyes, small and buried in fleshy folds, narrowed. "Profit's what a post is for, ain't it? And she's a high-risk prisoner. A firebug." He spat, just missing Holden's boot. "Burned a whole railroad supply depot to the ground up north. We're just collecting the damages for the territory. $20 is a bargain to take that kind of risk off my hands." Holden let his gaze drift from Pike, seeming to consider the shuttered window. "Firebug, huh?" His eyes were not on the window. They were scanning the architecture of the dry comet. It was a place built of desperation and scarcity. The walls were a patchwork of adobe brick and sun-warped planks. Under the main porch, tucked away in the shadows, sat a large, leaking barrel of black tar, doubtless for patching the roof. It was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. His gaze moved higher, following a rope that ran from the main porch beam up to a heavy iron bell mounted on the roof. The rope ran down the front of the building, tied off to a cleat near the main door, a simple, crude alarm. He made a show of rubbing his chin, looking around the side of the building as if inspecting its foundations. "Still, $20, he mused, letting the sentence hang. His eyes found the back wall, near the corner. It was the worst part of the structure. The adobe was crumbling, and one of the main support beams had slipped, leaving a vertical crack, a sliver of darkness, running from the ground to the eaves. "She ain't worth 10, the freight driver called out, already bored again. "She's worth what I say," Pike snapped. As Pike turned to yell at the driver, a flicker of movement near the stable caught Holden's eye. It was not a man. It was a girl, Tilda May, no more than 11, though the land had already carved a decade more onto her face. She was sweeping the porch of the attached bunkhouse with a broom made of tied-up twigs, a pointless endeavor that just moved the dust from one place to another. She was thin, dressed in a flour sack shirt, and she moved as if trying to take up no space at all. Pike looked back at Holden. "So, you in or out? Mister, I ain't got all day." As Pike spoke, the girl, Tilda, looked up. Her eyes met Holden's. They were not the cowed, fearful eyes he'd expected. They were bright and desperate, a message in them. While Pike's back was to her, she stopped sweeping. With a quick, almost invisible flick of her head, she gestured toward the rear of the main building. "Go around back." It was not a plea for her own safety. It was an instruction, an urgent, silent conspiracy. Holden gave no sign he had seen. He focused again on Pike, whose rumor had solidified something in Holden's mind. A railroad depot. He'd crossed the surveyor's fresh-cut stakes not 3 hours ago, marking a new line that would cut straight through this valley, a line that would need land and water. A firebug was a convenient label for someone who was in the way. "And what about him?" Holden asked, nodding at Caleb Rourke, who stood apart, polishing a pistol with an oily rag. "He part of the bargain?" "Rourke is my associate," Pike said stiffly. Rourke's head snapped up. "I'm the one who caught her, near the stables. She's got a sickness for it." As Pike had mentioned fire, and Rourke now mentioned the stables. Holden saw it. Rourke's eyes, for just 1 second, left Holden and flicked to the stable building. It was a quick, anxious, proprietary glance. This was not a man boasting of a capture. This was a man who had been genuinely spooked. He wasn't afraid of Maeve. He was afraid of what she might do to his property. His horses. Rourke had a weakness. He was terrified of fire. "Well," Holden said, "a man's got to consider his resources." He reached into his own vest, his hand fumbling as he pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. It was the bag he kept for small purchases, for whiskey and beans. He loosened the drawstring. Then, in a move of pure, calculated clumsiness, he let the bag slip from his grasp. It hit the dust with a soft, heavy thud. The pouch fell open, and a spray of silver coins, $8, maybe $9, scattered across the porch and into the dirt at Pike's feet. "Damn it," Holden swore, a perfect note of mild frustration in his voice. The effect was instantaneous. It was as if a fistful of corn had been thrown into a chicken coop. The bored riders surged forward, their apathy vanishing. "I saw that one man yelled, diving for a coin near the steps. "That one's mine," another shouted, shoulder-checking the freight driver. Even Orson Pike grunted, his dignity forgotten, as he bent his wide frame to snatch up the dollar that had landed on his own boot. Caleb Rourke, alone, held his ground, but his eyes were full of contempt for the fools scrambling in the dirt. In that single manufactured moment of chaos, Holden Vance was invisible. He did not stoop for the money. He did not watch the fight. He turned on his heel, his long legs eating up the ground, and rounded the corner of the trading post, disappearing from view. He moved fast, his boots silent in the deep dust at the side of the building. He reached the back wall. The crack was there, just as he'd seen. It was wider than he'd hoped, a good inch across. He pressed his face close to the rough, sun-baked wood. It was dark inside, and hot, the air thick with the smell of unmilled grain and confinement. "Mistress," he whispered, his voice low. "Can you hear me?" A rustle, a sharp intake of breath. Then a shadow moved in the darkness. "Who are you?" Her voice was a rasp, tight with suspicion. "A man passing through. I saw the shutter. I can get it open." He ran his hand over the heavy wooden planks. The bar was on the outside, a simple, heavy iron drop bar, but the brackets holding it were bolted through the wood. "The lock on the front is just a bar. I can break the brackets, but it will be loud, and it will be fast. When it opens, you run, no looking back. My horse is by the trough." There was a pause. He had expected thanks, or a plea. He got neither. "I don't need a ride." Her voice came, stronger now, clearer. "I need a guide. Will you take me to Carrion Bluff?" Holden froze. This was not the response of a simple victim. Carrion Bluff. He knew the name. It was a good 2 days' ride, a nasty maze of canyons and bad water on the edge of the territory. "Why there?" She said, and the word was full of venom. "Pike, he's not just selling me. He's holding me for the railroad. They'll be here by nightfall. I have to get to Carrion Bluff before they do." "What's at Carrion Bluff?" "Proof," she said. "Proof that will stop them. Will you take me?" It was a test. She wasn't asking for rescue. She was forging an alliance. She was a fugitive with a destination, and that made her infinitely more dangerous and more compelling. Holden made his choice. "I'll take you." He pressed his eye to the crack, but could see only her silhouette. "In exchange, you tell me right now, who wants you gone?" "The same people who signed that warrant," she said, her voice dropping to a low, furious murmur. "The ones who want the water under the Larkspur Valley. The ones who are stealing it. Now, get me out." "Done," Holden said. He didn't have lockpicks. He had a hunting knife and 17 years of mending fences. He pulled the heavy Bowie knife from the sheath on his belt. The brackets were the weak point, the old wood around them. He jammed the tip of the knife between the iron bracket and the plank. He didn't try to pick the lock. He tried to tear the wall apart. He put his shoulder against the shutter and his weight into the knife. The wood groaned. The iron shrieked. "What's that?" he heard Rourke yell from the front. Holden ignored him. He jammed the knife in deeper and threw his entire body against the shutter. Crack! The sound was as loud and final as a dropped coffin. The dry-rotted timber holding the top bracket splintered, tore, and gave way. The heavy iron bar, still in place, fell uselessly with the broken bracket, crashing to the ground. The shutter, freed from its lock, flew open. Maeve Calder stood there, not blinking in the sudden, blinding light. Her hands were tied in front of her. She had already been moving. "They're out back!" Pike's roar was a bellow of rage. The main alarm bell on the roof began to clang, a frantic, ugly, hammered sound. Holden didn't grab her. He didn't need to. "Now," he said. They burst from the shadows. Two figures, two arrows shot from the same bow, their long shadows stretching and cutting across the bright, unforgiving sun. They ran, their boots kicking up plumes of yellow dust, straight for the bay mare, who had already lifted her head. Her ears pricked, sensing the thunder in the air. The bay mare surged, a powerful lunge from a standstill, her muscles bunching with the surprise of the sudden two-person load. Holden had Maeve in front of him, hauling her bodily into the saddle as the first shout, "They're on the horse!" erupted from the porch. A bullet whined past, a high, angry mosquito, close enough to make his ear ring. "Hold on to the horn," he yelled, his voice a command that cut through the alarm bell's clang. He gave the mare her head, letting her run flat out, away from the post, toward the open, shimmering expanse of the silver wastes. They were a single, desperate target. Behind them, the chaos was a symphony of curses. Rourke's voice was the loudest, a furious roar. "Get the horses, get them! Don't let them reach the rocks!" Holden rode low, his body curved around Maeve's, one arm clamped around her waist to keep her steady, the other holding the reins. The hemp ropes on her wrists were a problem. They were still bound, her hands trapped in front of her. "My knife," he said, his mouth close to her ear, his words jolted by the gallop. "Left hip, get it!" He couldn't see her face, only the back of her head. The dark hair pulled loose from its pins, whipping in the hot wind. She struggled, her bound hands fumbling at his side. He felt the cold press of the hilt as she worked it free from the leather sheath. "Cut," he ordered. "Saw against the saddle horn. Fast." She didn't question. She wedged the knife handle between her palms and began sawing the thick rope against the hard, worn leather. The mare was breathing hard, her stride powerful but unsustainable. They were on open ground, and the men behind them would have fresh mounts. The rope gave. Maeve's hands flew apart. She dropped the knife into her lap and, in a single, fluid motion, grasped the saddle horn with one hand and took the reins from Holden with the other. "I can ride," she said, her voice sharp. Not a request, but a statement. "You can't steer and shoot. Give me the reins." Holden's hands, trained by 1,000 hard-ridden miles, wanted to resist, but he saw the way she balanced, the way her body instantly found the rhythm of the horse. She wasn't just a passenger, she was a horsewoman. He let go. "Where are we going?" he asked, his hand now free, moving to the Colt Thunderer holstered on his right hip. "Southwest, toward the ridge. It's the only cover for miles." She urged the mare on, not with her heels, but with a shift in her weight, conserving the animal's last burst of speed. They rode in silence for a time, the thud of hooves the only sound. The Dry Comet trading post was a shrinking blur of weathered wood behind them. "You said proof," Holden said, his voice calmer now, but no less urgent. "What proof?" Maeve kept her eyes on the horizon. The story came out in sharp, broken pieces, like the land itself. "I'm a guide, independent. I mark trails. I find water. I've worked for miners, for merchants, for the army." She glanced back at him, her eyes hard. 6 months ago, I took a job with a survey crew. They said they were mapping for a new cattle trail." A mental image, sharp and bright. Cut into the present Maeve, hidden in a stand of junipers, watching a lamplit tent. Two men, their faces arrogant, their voices carrying on the cold night air. A map unrolled. They weren't, she continued, her voice flat. They were railroad men. They were mapping the Larkspur Dam. It's the only reliable water in the whole valley. Feeds every small ranch from here to the county line. My ranch included. They're not just taking the land for the tracks, Holden said, finishing her thought. He'd seen this before. They're taking the water. All of it. They have a plan, a water rights seizure based on a faulty charter. It's a lie, but it's a legal-sounding lie. I watched them. I followed them. I found their real maps. I found the letters. Another image Maeve's hand, small and steady, reaching into a surveyor's saddlebag, pulling out a sheaf of papers. A letter, signed with a flourish, promising exclusive access in exchange for political considerations. They're paying men to say the water's drying up, paying them to say the dam is unstable. They're creating a panic to buy the land for pennies on the dollar before they announce the new line. And Pike, Holden asked. Pike is their back door. He moves their illegal supplies. He launders their cash. And he holds their problems. Her voice caught. A small, sharp sound of fury. I was getting too close. I knew too much. So Rourke arrested me. That firebug story, it was a lie to hold me, to discredit me. They were waiting for a railroad man, a special agent, to come and collect me. Pike was just trying to make some extra coin off me before the real buyer showed up. The proof, Holden pressed. Where is it? Carrion Bluff, in a cleft of rock, high on the east face. I wrapped the maps and the letters in oilcloth. I tied it with a blue ribbon, from my mother. I put it there 3 days ago. I was on my way to the territorial capital when Rourke found me. They reached the first low swell of the ridge, the ground turning from dust to rock. Maeve slowed the mare to a walk, the horse's sides heaving, foam dripping from her bit. Holden slid from the saddle. Let her breathe, he said. He looked back. It was there, the unmistakable sign. A plume of dust. Still small, but growing. It was miles away, but it was coming. Rourke, Maeve said. It was not a question. And the rest of them? He'll have them fanned out. Holden looked at Maeve. The red dust was still on her face, but her eyes were alive, burning with a purpose that had nothing to do with him. He unholstered his Colt and checked the cylinder. Full. He turned and saw Maeve watching his hands. That warrant, Holden said, his voice quiet, almost to himself. From Ash Hollow County. She nodded. A forgery, but it had a name. A Judge Merritt Quayle. Holden's blood ran cold. He looked away, at the distant, threatening dust. I know Judge Quayle. Maeve went still. How? He let out a long, slow breath, a breath that tasted of old regrets. Before I bought the ranch at Larkspur, I rode for a man who needed things done. For a time, I wore a badge for the Union Pacific. I was an escort, a guard. A new image, this one from Holden's past, a family, a man and a woman, standing by a sod house, a small well, their only water. Holden, younger, harder, sitting on his horse, his rifle in his lap. Another man, a man in a suit, handing the farmer a piece of paper. They said we were protecting the line, Holden said, his voice thick. But we were just clearing it. We weren't moving hostiles. We were moving farmers, men with legal claims, men who were in the way. He looked at Maeve, his eyes meeting hers, holding them. He had to say it. Ash Hollow. That's where I was. I watched a man in a suit, backed by my gun, hand a farmer an eviction notice for his own well, a notice signed by Judge Merritt Quayle. I watched that family walk away from everything, with nothing but what they could carry. He turned and slammed his fist into the hot rock of the ridge. I quit the next day. I rode until I found Larkspur, and I swore I'd never work for another man's greed again. That warrant Rourke had. It's the same lie, the same men, just a different county. Maeve looked at him, her expression unreadable. She had built her life on not trusting anyone. She had survived by being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than the men who thought they could own the land. She looked at the horizon, at the approaching dust. Then she looked at Holden. He was not a savior. He was not a hero. He was just a man, scarred by the same fire that was now threatening to consume her. He sat his horse like a man who was part of the animal, a man who belonged to the earth, like a landmark. "We need to switch," she said. Holden blinked. "A switch?" "They'll be riding hard, but they'll be watching for one horse, 2 riders. They'll catch us, but they won't be expecting a fight. Not a real one." She slid from the saddle, her movements stiff. She walked to him. "You ride better than I do. You know this mare. You can make her last, but I shoot better than you do." It was a blunt, unadorned statement, a fact. Holden looked at her, at the absolute certainty in her eyes. He had no reason to believe her, and every reason to. He broke into a short, harsh laugh. "You don't even know if I can shoot at all." "I know you can," she said. "I also know you'd rather not. Your hand hesitated when you checked that pistol. You're a rancher. I'm a survivor. Give it to me." A moment suspended in the vast, hot silence of the wastes. The alliance was being forged, not with words, but with weight and steel. He held the Colt Thunderer out, grip first. Her hand, still raw and red from the ropes, closed around it. Her fingers were long, her grip sure. She didn't check the cylinder. She just balanced the weapon, feeling its weight, making it an extension of her own will. Their fingers brushed. His hand was calloused and warm. Her hand was steady and cool. "Get in the saddle," she said, her voice the command of a guide. "Ride. I'll be your rear guard. When they get close, you ride. Don't stop for me. Just get to the rocks. I'll slow them down." He mounted, swinging his leg over. He looked down at her. "I'm not leaving you." "You won't," Maeve said, turning to face the approaching dust cloud, which was no longer a cloud, but the distinct, dark shapes of horses and men. "You're just giving me a better shot." She put her foot into the stirrup, and he hauled her up, this time to sit behind him, her legs hooked, riding as a passenger, but a passenger armed for war. "Now," she said, her voice a low growl in his ear, the cold metal of the Thunderer's barrel resting lightly against his back. "Ride like hell." The bay mare was a good horse, but she was not a miracle. She scrambled up the first incline of Switchback Ridge, her hooves striking sparks on the flint-hard trail. The path was a lie, a series of sharp, upward-climbing zags that offered no cover, only brutal exposure. Each step was a gamble on loose shale. The ridge was not made of stone so much as a mountain of broken, knife-edged plates. It was, Holden thought, like trying to ride a horse up a pile of shattered glass. He kept his weight low, his thighs clamped, his hands light on the reins. He could feel the heat radiating from the animal, the tremor of exhaustion starting in her flanks. Behind him, Maeve was a solid, balanced presence. The Colt Thunderer held steady in her hand, her body moving with his, with the horse. "They're gaining," she said, her voice a low murmur, not a whisper. It was a fact, stated for the record. He looked back. Rourke and 4 others. They were riding hard, their horses fresh, their intent a black stain against the yellow rock. Rourke was in the lead, his face a knot of fury, his rifle already unslung. "They think they have us," Holden said, his eyes scanning the path ahead. It funneled into a narrow cut, a man-made notch in the rock from some long-forgotten prospecting effort. "They're right. On this path, they'll run us down." "So we don't stay on the path," Maeve said. "Not yet." Holden saw it. Just inside the narrow cut, half hidden by a dead juniper, was a barrel. It was old, hoops rusted, but the black, sticky residue staining the rocks below it was unmistakable. Tar, left by a road crew or a dreamer. It didn't matter. It was a gift. "Keep her moving," he said, and slid from the saddle before the mare had even stopped. He slapped her flank. "Go through the cut, I'm right behind you." "Holden!" Maeve's voice was sharp, but he was already moving. He grabbed the reins, pulling the mare with him as he ran to the barrel. Rourke, seeing him dismount, gave a hoot of triumph. "He's finished, his horse is done." A rifle shot cracked, the bullet screaming off the rock wall, peppering Holden's back with stone chips. He ignored it. He reached the barrel. It was heavy, maybe a quarter full. He put his shoulder to it, his boot slipping, and rolled it. The barrel tipped, crashing onto its side, and a thick, dark artery of tar began to ooze onto the trail. "Go! Maeve! Get through!" he yelled, giving the mare a final, hard shove. The horse lunged forward, scrambling through the cut, Maeve ducking low. Holden pulled his pistol. Rourke and his men were 50 yards out, slowing as they saw the obstacle. Holden didn't shoot at them. He aimed at the pool of tar, 6 feet from his boots, and fired. The first shot was a heavy thwack, gouging the rock. The second, a glancing blow, sent a white-hot spark. It was not enough. "Damn it," he hissed. Rourke was dismounting, taking careful aim. Holden fumbled in his vest, his fingers finding the small tin of sulfur matches. He pulled one out, struck it on the rock, and tossed it. The match flared, hit the tar, and died with a small puff. Rourke fired. The bullet tore through the sleeve of Holden's shirt, a hot, searing line. Holden struck the entire remaining bunch of matches, a fistful of fire, and threw them underhand. The world erupted. The tar didn't just catch, it exploded. A percussive whoomph that knocked Holden off his feet, a geyser of greasy, impenetrable black smoke boiling into the sky. It filled the cut instantly, a solid wall of night. He scrambled to his feet, his ears ringing, and ran, his lungs burning. He burst through the other side of the smoke cloud, choking, and grabbed the reins of the mare, who was rearing in terror. Maeve had her under control, her face pale but set. He swung into the saddle behind her, the Colt now in his hand. "That bought us time," he gasped. "It won't last," she said, and pointed. The smoke was a perfect screen, but Rourke was no fool. He was already splitting his men, 2 going over the ridge, 2 staying on the trail, waiting for the smoke to clear. They rode. The ridge opened up into a high, desolate plateau, littered with the corpses of a dead mining operation, rotting timbers, rusted ore carts, and the skeletal frame of a head house. The 2 riders who had gone over the ridge appeared, cutting them off. They were 200 yards out, but they had the angle. "Ride for the station," Maeve yelled, pointing to the main building. A rifle cracked. The bullet kicked up dust by the mare's front hooves. "I can't get a shot from this angle," Holden said, the horse's gait too jarring. "I can," Maeve said. She took the pistol from his hand, her movement fluid. "Slow her, just for a second." Holden pulled back on the reins, the mare dropping to a trot. Maeve twisted, her body a strange, strained line. The pursuers were yelling, sensing the kill. One of them, a big man on a gray horse, was riding toward a heavy iron bell mounted on a wooden frame, a signal bell for the abandoned mine. Maeve did not aim for the man. She aimed for the bell. She fired. The shot was a single, sharp crack. In the high, thin air, the clang of the bullet hitting the bell was shockingly loud. It was a clear, resonant, demanding sound. It rang out, echoing off the canyon walls, not as a single strike, but as a cascade of sound, a peal of alarm. The effect was magical. The 2 riders, their brains hardwired to respond to that very sound, pulled up in confusion. Their horses wheeled. The sound was coming from everywhere. The echo made it seem as if a warning was being sounded from the canyon ahead of them. "Again," Holden said, his voice grim. She fired again. Clang, the echo was worse. A phantom army ringing bells. The two men turned, shouting to each in confusion, and wheeled their horses, riding away from them, down a false draw, toward the source of the loudest echo. "Brilliant," Holden breathed. "But Rourke won't fall for it." "He doesn't have to," Maeve said, handing the pistol back. "He's on foot, but the other two are still coming. We have to get off this ridge." She pointed, not to a path, but to a gap in the rocks. Below it, a steep slope of loose shale and gravel fell away into the dark slash of a dry creek bed. 100 feet below. "You're crazy," he said. "It's that or a bullet. Go." He didn't argue. He pointed the mare's head at the gap, gave her a reassuring pat, and kicked her forward. The horse, sensing the drop, balked. "No," Maeve said, sliding off. "We'll kill her. We slide. The horse will follow. She's smart." She grabbed his hand. "On my count." They ran to the edge and jumped, feet first. It was not a fall, but a controlled, chaotic slide. The shale was loose, a river of sharp rocks. It tore at Holden's boots, his hands. He went down, rolling, the rocks like teeth. He saw Maeve beside him, her face a mask of pained concentration. They tumbled, slid, and crashed, landing in a cloud of dust on the sandy bottom of the arroyo. Holden's head hit the ground. For a second, the world was stars. He heard the mare, whinnying in panic from the ridge above. Then he heard Rourke's voice, directly overhead, screaming with rage. They went over the side. After them. Find them. I want them alive by tonight. I'll have them both tied to a railroad marker. Holden grabbed Maeve and pulled her, stumbling, into a thick, dense grove of tamarisk trees that grew against the canyon wall. The salty, feathery branches closed around them, swallowing them in a dark, dusty green world. They collapsed, breathing sand, their lungs on fire. Above, the mare, seeing no other way, began her own, careful descent. They lay still. They could hear the men, dismounted, crashing down the slope. They heard Rourke, dividing them. "You two, go downstream, Jake. You're with me. We'll take the upstream trail. They're in this bed somewhere. Find their tracks." A man, one of the pair heading downstream, was walking straight toward their hiding place. He was a good tracker, his eyes on the sand. He stopped, not 10 feet from the tamarisk grove. He'd seen the marks of their fall. Holden's hand went to his knife. He would not be taken. Then a sound, a pebble, skittering from the bank. Further upstream, the tracker's head snapped up. A small figure, thin as a rail, was scrambling down the bank. Tilda May. She was on a small, shaggy mule, her face white with terror and a desperate, driving purpose. She had followed them. She had followed the whole mad chase. Rourke, upstream, hadn't seen her, but the tracker had. He raised his rifle. "Who's there?" Tilda didn't look at him. She was carrying a small, heavy sack, one that Holden recognized from the trading post's porch, powdered lime. She reached the bottom of the creek bed, where a tiny, seasonal trickle of water still ran. With a grunt, she upended the bag. A cloud of white powder billowed, and a thick, milky slurry began to flow. Not downstream toward the tracker, but upstream, following the faint current of the spring. "What in the hell?" the tracker said, confused. He looked at the white trail, a stark, obvious, unnatural line. "Hey, over here they left a trail, a white one." His partner, downstream, yelled, "We got 'em." The two men, convinced, began to run, following the false, bright white line of Tilda's ruse, a trail that would lead them a mile up a box canyon before it faded. Tilda May, her task done, slid from her mule, her small body trembling. She looked, once, at the tamarisk grove, her eyes wide. She knew. Maeve moved first. She broke from the cover, her hand held up. "Wait!" Tilda froze, her eyes on Maeve. Maeve walked to her. She didn't have time for words. She reached into her own boot, a place Rourke had not thought to check, and pulled out a single, thin, silver piece. She pressed it into Tilda's small, chapped hand. "Thank you," Maeve whispered, her voice rough with emotion. Tilda's eyes filled with tears, but she did not cry. She just nodded, her jaw tight. "Tomorrow," Maeve said, her voice a fierce promise, "when I come back, I am going to teach you your letters. You hear me?" Tilda nodded again. She scrambled back onto her mule, a ghost disappearing into the rocks, just as the first rumble of thunder echoed down the canyon. Holden and Maeve looked up. The sky, a perfect, empty blue an hour ago, was now a bruised, churning purple. The wind turned cold, whipping their torn clothes. A storm, a big one, was building, the clouds piling up like black, angry mountains. The thunder cracked again. Not a rumble, but the flat, sharp report of 1,000 war drums. "Carrion Bluff," Holden said, pulling the mare from the rocks where she'd finally made her way down. "We have to get there, now." They rode for another hour, the storm at their heels, the air electric. They reached the bluff as the first drops of rain, cold and as big as bullets, began to fall. It was not a ridge, it was an ending. A sheer, 1,000-foot drop into the valley below. They found a shallow overhang, barely a cave, a scoop taken out of the rock. It was not shelter, but it was all they had. Holden pulled the saddle from the mare, using the blanket to cover them both. They huddled together against the cold stone, the rain turning to a metallic, hish, driving sheet. The world was noise, the wind screaming, the thunder cracking directly overhead. They were small, wet, and exhausted. In a brief lull between thunderclaps, Maeve spoke, her voice quiet, but carrying over the wind. She was not speaking to him. She was speaking to the storm. "If I don't get back," she said, her breath a white plume in the sudden cold, "the water at Larkspur Dam will be theirs." The storm broke over Carrion Bluff with the violence of a declaration of war. It was not rain. It was a solid, wind-driven wall of water that turned the world beyond their shallow overhang into a gray, roaring chaos. The wind shrieked, a high-pitched, maddened sound that clawed at their crude shelter. They were huddled under the rock, wrapped in the single saddle blanket, the smell of wet wool and ozone sharp in the air. Holden had managed to build a small, smokeless fire from a packet of tinder and some dry, dead wood he'd found in the back of the cleft. It was a pitiful thing, a small cluster of red embers that fought a losing battle against the cold, wet air. But it was a center. It was a point of life. In the flickering, dying light, he looked at Maeve. She was shivering, her arms wrapped around her knees, her face pale with exhaustion. Her wrists, he saw, were raw, the skin broken and dark with blood from the hemp rope. She had not complained. She had not so much as flinched since they'd escaped. He said nothing, but shifted, reaching for his saddlebag, which he'd thrown into the back of the small cave. He pulled out his canteen and a strip of clean linen he kept for bandages. He uncorked the canteen and dampened the cloth, his movements slow, deliberate. He held the cloth out. She looked at it, then at him. He saw the suspicion in her eyes, the ingrained distrust of any gesture that might be a prelude to a debt. "It'll fester," he said, his voice a low rumble under the storm's percussion. "If you let it." She held out her hands, a small, reluctant movement. He knelt in front of her. The space was tight, their knees almost touching. He took her left wrist. His touch was impossibly gentle. His thumb was calloused, the skin tough as old leather, but it brushed her broken skin with the lightness of a moth's wing. He avoided the raw, open flesh, his fingers supporting her hand, his other hand working the damp cloth, carefully, patiently cleaning away the grit and the dried blood. She watched his hands. She watched the absolute focus in his eyes. He was not looking at her face. He was looking at his work. A man mending a broken rein. These were hands that could break a horse or build a fence. They were strong, practical hands. And they were, she realized, completely safe. Hands that know how to keep a promise, she said, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the rain. More than how to hold a person. He paused, his work half finished. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers in the gloom. He didn't understand the words. Not fully, but he understood the ache behind them. He said nothing, just went back to his task, cleaning the second wrist with the same meticulous care. He wrapped both with the clean linen, his knots firm, but not tight. When he was done, his hands lingered for a half-second, his thumbs resting on her bandaged wrists. He let go and sat back on his heels, the space between them. Now that he was no longer touching her, felt colder. The storm raged. It was a wall, sealing them off from Rourke, from the world, in the dark. With the rain as their witness, they began to talk. The words came slowly at first. Ghosts in the dark. "My ranch," Holden said, his gaze on the dying embers. "It's not much, just a patch of good grass and a house that needs a roof. But the water is clean." He spoke of the simple, physical work. The smell of fresh-cut hay, the quiet satisfaction of a well-mended gate. He spoke of the silence, a silence that had, until today, been a comfort. Now, he realized, it had also been a loneliness. Maeve listened. She spoke of her own life, not in a narrative, but in fragments. The smell of pine resin in the high country, the taste of snowmelt water, the specific, perfect blue of the sky at dawn, before the heat came. She spoke of a life lived by her own rules, a life of freedom that was, she admitted, just another word for constant vigilance. "I dream of a house with thick walls," she said, her voice a murmur. "A place where the wind can't get in, a table, a real one, made of heavy wood, and coffee, the smell of it, in the morning, before anyone else is awake." He saw it. He saw the dream. It was his own. The last of the embers winked out, plunging them into a deeper darkness, lit only by the occasional, brilliant white flash of lightning from the valley below. The cold was immediate, a tangible, biting thing. Maeve shivered, a violent, full-body tremor she couldn't suppress. Holden shifted, moving from his knees to sit beside her on the saddle blanket. "We'll freeze like this," he said, his voice practical. He pulled the other half of the heavy wool blanket, the part he'd been sitting on, and draped it over her shoulders, pulling her toward him. She stiffened. It was a reflex, the ingrained reaction of a woman who had been alone for too long. "It's just for warmth," he said, his voice quiet. He made no other move. She relaxed, but only fractionally. He was right. The shared heat was a necessity. She leaned her head back against the cold stone, and he did the same. They sat side by side, a rigid, proper distance between them, under the shared tent of the blanket, listening to the world tear itself apart. "You're a good man, Holden Vance," she said after a long time. "I haven't always been," he replied, his voice rough. "The things I did, for the railroad, for men like Quayle. I thought I was just doing a job. I was just wrong." "You're here now," she said. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer empty. He turned his head, in the gloom. He could just make out the profile of her face, the strong line of her jaw, the damp strands of hair stuck to her cheek. She was not a damsel. She was a warrior. She was the toughest, most resolute person he had ever met. And he was He realized, beginning to feel something for her that was vast and new and terrifying. He did not want to frighten her. He did not want to be one more man who saw her as something to be owned. He shifted, just slightly, turning his body toward hers. He did not move closer. Not yet. He just waited. He looked at her, and his eyes, in the dark, asked the question his voice would not. "May I?" She turned her head, meeting his gaze. She saw no hunger in his eyes. She saw no demand. She saw only the quiet, steady question. She saw the man who had cleaned her wounds, the man who had confessed his own shame, the man who had ridden with her. Not for her. She held his gaze for a long, still heartbeat. Then, her eyes never leaving his, she gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was all the answer he needed. He leaned in. He did not rush. He gave her every chance to turn away. He closed the last few inches, his gaze dropping to her mouth. His lips brushed hers. It was a question. She answered, her own lips parting slightly. The first kiss was as soft and wet as the moss on the rocks around them. It was tentative, a discovery. It tasted of rain and salt and the cold night air. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition. "Oh, there you are." Then, a low rumble of thunder, deep in the earth, moved through them. The kiss changed. It deepened. He felt a tremor go through her. Or perhaps it was him. His breath, hot and unsteady, ghosted her cheek. Her breath, a small, sharp gasp, was lost in his mouth. His hand, which had been braced on the ground, came up. He did not grab her. He did not pull. He laid his palm flat on her back, a solid, grounding, respectful touch. He felt the tension in her shoulder blades, and he just held. His thumb stroked the wet fabric of her shirt, a small, reassuring circle. Her hand, the one with the freshly bandaged wrist, came up. It rested on his shoulder. Then, as the kiss grew deeper, more certain, her fingers curled, gripping the rough wool of his jacket. Her other hand came up, not to push him away, but to steady herself, her palm flat against his chest, right over his heart. She felt it, pounding, a wild, fast rhythm that matched her own. She moved that hand, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, and then her hand slid around his neck, her fingers tangling in the damp hair at his nape, pulling him closer. It was a kiss that unraveled the day. It unraveled the fear, the running, the certainty of death. It was a raw, desperate, and profoundly gentle claiming of life. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. They rested their foreheads together, their eyes closed. The sound of the rain was a dull roar, a distant engine. The only thing that mattered was the circle of their breath, hot and shared. "Maeve," he whispered, the name a prayer. "Holden," she breathed, the name an anchor. Without a word, he shifted, pulling the saddle, his only pillow, to the back of the cave. He lay down on the hard, cold stone and opened his arm. It was an invitation, not an order. She lay down beside him, fitting herself against his side, her head resting in the hollow of his shoulder. He pulled the saddle blanket up, covering them both. He tucked it around her, his arm going securely around her shoulders, holding her, not as a prisoner, but as a promise. They were fully clothed, their boots still on. The intimacy was not in what was taken, but in what was shared. The warmth, the shelter, the terrifying, fragile moment of peace. They lay like that for a long time, the rhythm of their breathing slowing, their heartbeats, which had been racing, finding a slower, steadier cadence. They were a single point of warmth in a world of cold stone and water. As the first gray light of a false dawn began to creep into the sky, and the storm began to subside, Maeve's exhaustion finally began to pull her under. But her mind, the guide's mind, The survivor's mind would not let go. She spoke, her eyes still closed, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Tomorrow, when we find the bluff, if I say run, Holden, you run, don't stop, don't look back, just go." He tightened his grip on her shoulder, pulling her infinitesimally closer. He kissed the top of her head, the hair damp and smelling of the storm. "I will always come back for you, Maeve," he whispered, his voice a low, rough vow against her hair. "But I'll do it, after I've gotten you clear of the gunfire." She let out a long, slow breath, a sound of release, and for the first time since Rourke had put a rope on her, Maeve Calder slept. The dawn broke clean, as if the storm had scoured the sky, washing it to a pale, fragile blue. The air was cold and sharp, smelling of wet stone and the faint, green scent of juniper. They had woken stiff and sore, the intimacy of the night giving way to the raw urgency of the morning. They left the mare, her coat still damp, tethered in the small shelter. The bluff was a maze of high, wind-carved stone, and Maeve moved through it with the confidence of a person walking through her own home. She led Holden along a narrow, treacherous ledge, the valley floor a misty, green and purple map 1,000 feet below. "It's here," she said. She stopped at a place that looked no different from any other stretch of sheer rock. She reached into a deep, vertical fissure, her arm disappearing up to the elbow. Her fingers brushed something. She pulled, and a small, bright flash of color came with her. It was a blue ribbon, a simple silk ribbon, its color shockingly bright against the red rock, a piece of a civilized world long gone. It was tied to a loop of twine, which in turn was tied to an oilcloth-wrapped packet. Maeve's hands trembled, not from cold, but from relief. She pulled the packet free. It was the size of a large book, heavy and dense. They returned to the overhang, to the relative safety of their camp. Holden rebuilt the fire, this time for warmth. As Maeve carefully unwrapped her cache, the oilcloth was stiff, but it had held. The contents were perfectly dry. Holden watched as she laid the items out on the saddle blanket, one by one. It was a history of a crime. First, the maps, not the rough sketches of a surveyor, but finished, detailed railroad engineering plans. They showed the new line, the spur, the depot, and, at the center of it all, a massive shaded area marked Larkspur Reservoir, UPRR exclusive access. "They're not just diverting the water," Holden said, his voice a low, angry growl. "They're planning to flood the low-lying ranches, mine included." "To make the dam bigger," Maeve said, her finger tracing the line. "They'll buy us out for pennies with the drought story, then flood us out for good. No one can ever come back." Next, the letters. There were 3. They were not forgeries. They were on the official letterhead of the Ash Hollow County Court. They were progress reports, written in a florid, self-important hand, detailing the removal of squatters and community pacification in preparation for the railroad's expansion. And at the bottom of each one, the signature, Merritt Quayle, Circuit Judge. The third item was a contract, a thick one, full of dense legal print. It was a deed of water rights transfer, selling the entirety of the Larkspur Dam and its aquifer to the Union Pacific Railroad for the sum of $1. It was, as Maeve had said, void. It was missing the required signatures from the territorial governor and the Water Commission. It was a legal prop, a weapon to be used after the farmers had already been scared away. "This is it," Holden said, his voice tight. "This is enough. We take this to Larkspur. The circuit court is in session this week. We walk in, we lay this on the federal marshal's desk. We call Quayle out in public. He can't run from this." Maeve was silent. She had not finished. She reached into the packet and pulled out the last item. It was not a legal document. It was a small, leather-bound notebook, its cover soft with use. She opened it. Holden leaned in. The pages were filled with a neat, sloping script. It was a list, not of numbers, but of names. Elias Thorne. 3 children. Well depth. 42 feet. Sarah and Ben Cotter. No kin. Well depth. 50 feet. Will be dry by August. Samuel Green. 1 son. Lost to fever. Well depth. 38 feet. On and on it went. A meticulous, heartbreaking ledger of every small rancher, every family, every well in the valley. It was a list of victims. "This," Maeve said, her voice thick, "is what I was doing. Not just finding the proof. I was documenting the cost. I was giving them names." Holden touched the page, his calloused finger tracing the name Samuel Green. This was not a fight about maps and contracts. It was a fight for the people on these pages. "My plan stands," Holden said, his resolve hardening. "A public fight. It's the only way. We have to be the ones to show this." Maeve looked at him, and for the first time, he saw the guide, the strategist. Look through him. "And what's Rourke doing?" "Holden right now." He went quiet. "He's not at the bottom of the bluff, licking his wounds," she said, her voice sharp. "He's riding. He's riding to Larkspur. He's not trying to catch us. He's trying to get ahead of us. The road to Larkspur is one road. He and his men will be sitting on it, in the rocks, just waiting. We'll be riding into a shooting gallery. So we fight our way through," he said. "And get this," she said, tapping the precious, damning letters. "Shot to pieces, get ourselves killed. A dead man's evidence is just a story. Holden, it's not proof." She stood up, pacing the small cave, her mind racing. "No, not a public fight, a legal one. We gamed this out all wrong. We have to be smarter. We have to set a trap, not walk into one." She stopped. "Reverend Ellery, at the First Presbyterian in Larkspur, he's a good man, and he's the town crier. He reads the Sunday bulletin, but he also reads news, announcements, things the town needs to know. He's the only man in town with a printing press who can't be bought." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we make a copy, a good one. I can fake Quayle's signature well enough to make it look real. We get that copy to Reverend Ellery. We tell him, if we're not at your door by sundown, you print this, you read this, you nail it to the courthouse door. It's an insurance policy. It's a dead man's switch." Holden stared at her, a slow, deep admiration dawning. That's good. Maeve, that's really good." "It's not enough," she said, frustration in her voice. "We still have to get the originals into town, and that's where we'll be." A pebble skittered at the mouth of the cave. Holden had his pistol out before the sound had died. He moved to the opening, pressing his back to the wall. Maeve was beside him, her own knife in her hand. "Mistress Maeve," a small, trembling voice called. "Mr. Vance." Holden and Maeve looked at each other. "Tilda," Maeve called, her voice sharp with disbelief. Tilda May peeked around the rock, her face smudged with dirt and tears, her mule's reins clutched in her hand. Behind her was not just the mule, but a small, rickety buckboard wagon. "How in God's name?" Holden started, lowering his pistol. I followed the tracks," Tilda said, her voice a small, brave squeak. "After the men went away, I followed you. I know these bluffs. I hide here sometimes." She looked at Maeve, her eyes wide. "You have to come now. You have to come. I heard them." "Heard who?" Maeve said, moving forward, putting a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Mr. Pike and Mr. Rourke. They came back to the post, just after the storm. Rourke he was so mad. He said you were gone, that you were heading for Larkspur. And Mr. Pike, he got scared, real scared." Tilda was talking fast, the words tumbling out. "He said the special agent from the railroad was coming. He said he wasn't going to be left holding the bag. He's packing. "Mistress Maeve, he's packing all his goods, all his ledgers. He's loading his wagon. He said he's leaving tonight, heading for the border, before the railroad man or the marshal shows up." Holden and Maeve stared at each other. The entire game had just changed. "His ledgers," Maeve said, her voice a low, sudden hiss. "Holden, his ledgers. They'll have everything, names, dates, payments. It's the other half of the proof." Holden's mind was racing, the pieces clicking into place. "Pike's running. He's taking his evidence with him. Rourke is on the road to Larkspur. That means—" "The trading post," Maeve finished, her eyes gleaming with a new, dangerous light. "It's empty. Just Pike, and he's a coward." "We can't," Holden said, the caution in him fighting the opportunity. "It's too risky. We have the proof we need right here." "No," Maeve said. She grabbed his arm. "Tilda just gave us the way. We don't ride to Larkspur. Not yet. We go back to the Dry Comet." "What to?" "To make a trade," Maeve said. "Tilda, that wagon, is it sturdy?" "Yes, ma'am," Tilda said. "It's old, but it's good." "Good." Maeve turned to Holden, her plan forming in real time. "We don't go to the court. We don't go to the Reverend. Not first. We go to Mrs. Alberta Klein." "The lawyer," Holden said, surprised. She's honest." "She's more than honest," Maeve said. "She's smart, and she hates the railroad. We're not going to swap copies. We're going to swap cargo. We're going to take Pike's wagon of goods, and we're going to replace it with a wagon of rocks. And the real cargo, Tilda is going to drive it, nice and slow, straight to Mrs. Klein's back door." "It was insane. It was brilliant." "We need to move," Holden said. His choice made. They spent the next hour preparing. Maeve, her hands now steady, repacked the oilcloth. Holden checked the mare, saddled her, and then turned his attention to Tilda's small, rickety harness. "This won't do," he said, his voice gentle. He unstrapped a heavy-duty leather line from his own saddle rigging. "A harness is like a promise. It can't ever break." He showed Tilda how to tie the traces with a double-loop safety knot. "This way, even if the pin breaks, the wagon won't run. You understand?" Tilda nodded, her small hands mimicking his, her face a mask of concentration. Maeve watched them, a small, pained, soft expression on her face. "You're as brave as springweed." "Tilda," she said, touching the girl's hair. You find a crack in the rock and you grow." Tilda looked up and, for the first time, she smiled. They stood on the edge of the bluff, ready to descend. Holden on the mare, Maeve and Tilda in the small wagon. The plan was set. They would take the low road, the one that followed the creek bed, back to the trading post. As they started their descent, far below, in the town of Larkspur, a sound, faint and clear, floated up on the clean-washed air, a single, heavy bell, tolling the hour. Dong, 12 o'clock, noon. "The church bell," Holden said. Maeve looked at the sky. The clouds were gone. The sun was a brilliant, hard, white-hot circle. It was going to be a long, fierce afternoon. "The plan's in motion," she said, and snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward. The Dry Comet trading post was a different place from the one they had fled. The high, frantic energy of the chase was gone, replaced by a low, desperate thrum of escape. Orson Pike was getting out, and he was taking everything. Holden had left the mare a mile back, in a stand of cottonwoods. He and Maeve approached on foot, using the low arroyo Tilda had used as their covered path. Tilda herself was in the buckboard, making a wide, slow circle. Just a girl gathering firewood, ready to play her part. They crouched behind a rusted-out water trough, surveying the scene. Tilda's report, it seemed, had been half right. Pike was leaving, but she had been wrong. dangerously wrong, about one thing. Caleb Rourke was not on the road to Larkspur. He was standing on the front porch of the main building, a greener shotgun cradled in his left arm, a Colt on his hip. He wasn't just guarding. He was a coiled spring, a man who had been cheated and was waiting for a chance to settle the score. He was staring at the road, at the horizon, as if expecting the devil himself. "He's still here," Holden whispered, his voice a low, hard knot. "The plan's shot. We can't get near the front." Maeve didn't look at Rourke. She looked at the warehouse, the long, low building attached to the main post. She saw two of Pike's hired men, the same ones who had lounged on the porch, now grumbling as they loaded heavy crates onto a large freight wagon. Inside the main post, through the dirty window, they could see Pike. He wasn't packing. He was in his office, his bulk hunched over his desk. He was counting. Stacks of coin, small chests. He was liquidating. "The plan's not shot," Maeve said, her voice barely a breath. "It just got harder. Rourke's waiting for us to come from the road. He's not watching his back." She pointed. "Holden, you were a guard. You look like a traitor. Tilda said Pike is waiting on one last shipment of salt from a freighter. Be that freighter." "And you?" he asked. "I'm just a porter, carrying a late delivery." She had found a worn, stained duster coat in the wagon, and a flat cap, with her hair tucked up, in the dust and shadows. She could pass. "The crate," Holden said, pointing to the oilcloth-wrapped packet at his feet. "Is in here," Maeve said, patting a wooden box marked kerosene, highly flammable, that Tilda had found for them. "We fill their wagon. We just have to swap one box. His ledgers are in the office. That's the prize." "This is madness," Holden said. But he was already moving, walking out from the arroyo, not with the stealth of an infiltrator, but with the weary, plodding gait of a man at the end of a long, dull job. He walked straight toward the two men loading the wagon. "You Pike's men!" he called out, his voice pitched to a tone of mild irritation. The two men stopped, their hands on a heavy crate. "Who's asking?" one of them said, his hand dropping to his pistol. "Name's Vance. I'm hauling 20 bags of salt for the Hummingbird Trust. Pike was meant to pay me on delivery. I've been waiting 2 hours. Where's my money?" The two men looked at each other, their suspicion giving way to a shared, familiar grievance. "Get in line, mister," the first man said. "He's in there counting his own silver while we're out here breaking our backs for vouchers. He ain't paid us in a month." "Vouchers," Holden said, letting a note of outrage enter his voice. "He promised me silver. I ain't hauling 1,000 pounds of salt for a piece of paper." "That's all you'll get," the second man spat. "Same as us. He said he'd clear it up this afternoon, but he's packing to run. I'll bet you $10 those vouchers are worthless." "He can't do that," Holden said, faking a new panic. "That's 3 weeks' pay for me. He has to pay." As the argument escalated, a predictable, petty squabble about who was owed what. No one was looking at the side of the warehouse. No one. That is, except Tilda May. She drove the small buckboard, the mule walking at a funeral pace, straight toward the side of the main building, toward the front porch. She drove it right into Rourke's line of sight. "Hey!" Rourke bellowed, stepping off the porch, his shotgun leveling. "Get that piece of junk out of here, girl." Tilda, her face a perfect mask of pale terror, pulled hard on the reins. The mule stopped. Tilda fumbled with the harness, and then, with a sharp crack that sounded just like snapping wood, the left wheel of the buckboard canted inward at a sick, broken angle. Tilda, in her brilliance, had pulled the linchpin Holden had shown her, just as they'd planned. The wagon was broken. "Oh, no!" Tilda wailed, a convincing, high-pitched cry. "No, no, no! It broke, mister! It broke!" Rourke swore, a long, vicious string of curses. The wagon, with its broken axle, was blocking the main path to the freight wagon. It was a nuisance, an obstacle, and it had appeared at the worst possible moment. "You stupid girl," he snarled. He strode to the wagon, his shotgun still in hand, but his attention, his focus, his entire burning rage was now on the broken wheel. "Get out of the way, I'll get this piece of—" He leaned in, trying to see the axle. At that exact second, as Rourke was distracted by the wheel, as Holden was arguing loudly with the two porters about worthless vouchers, Maeve moved. She slipped from the shadows behind the warehouse, the kerosene crate in her hands. She was just another porter, just a shadow. She walked, not ran, through the warehouse's open back door. The warehouse was a cavern of shadows, piled high with goods. She moved past them, to the one door that led to the office. She heard Pike inside, the clink, clink, clink of coins. She heard Holden, his voice rising, "I want my pay." She didn't go to the office, not yet. She went to the loading dock, where the freight wagon was half full. She saw the stack of Pike's personal goods. One crate, marked with a distinctive black P, was identical to the one in her hands. She set her crate down. She picked up Pike's crate. It was heavy, full of rocks, a crate she and Holden had packed 2 hours ago. She walked back, her movements economical, precise as loading a cartridge. She placed the rock-filled kerosene crate with Pike's other goods. The swap was made. The real evidence, the maps, the letters, her ledger, were now sitting in the back of the wagon, ready to be driven to freedom. But she wasn't done. She slipped into the office. Pike was so focused on his gold, his back to the door, that he didn't even hear her. His ledgers, 3 thick, leather-bound books, were in a crate on the floor by his feet. Maeve lifted them, one by one, and put them into her now empty kerosene box. She was on her way out, a ghost. When she paused, she reached into her duster and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a fake invoice, one she had spent an hour perfecting. Received, 1 crate, geological samples. For delivery to Judge M. Quayle, payment due on receipt. She left it on his desk, in the ring of wetness left by his whiskey glass. A trap, a piece of bait so perfect, Pike would have no choice but to bite, to race to the courthouse himself to deny any connection to Quayle. She slipped back into the shadows of the warehouse. She was almost clear. "You?" Rourke's voice. He had given up on the wheel. He had seen her. A flash of movement through the warehouse door. "Pike, we got him!" Rourke yelled, raising his shotgun. A shot boomed, the sound deafening. The buckshot tearing a shower of splinters from the doorframe where Maeve had been a second before. Holden, hearing the shot, drew his pistol. "Maeve!" He ran for the warehouse door. Maeve burst out, not toward him, but toward the side. "The chute! Holden! The chute!" He saw what she meant. A heavy wooden trapdoor in the warehouse floor, used for loading grain into the cellar. Rourke was in the doorway, leveling his shotgun for a second. More careful shot. Holden didn't shoot at Rourke. He shot the heavy bolt latch on the trapdoor. The bullet shrieked on the iron. The latch shattered. Holden grabbed the ring, tore the door open. A black, dusty square opened at their feet. "Now!" he yelled. He grabbed Maeve, and they fell, tumbling into the darkness, sliding down the polished, steep wooden chute. They landed hard, in a cloud of ancient dust and chaff, in the cellar. "This way!" Maeve coughed, grabbing his hand, pulling him through the dark toward the cellar's back exit. They burst out into the sunlight, behind the stables, choking, covered in dust. "There!" Tilda's voice. The girl was a miracle. She had fixed her broken wheel and was now in the driver's seat of the main freight wagon, the one containing all the proof. She had her mule tied to the back, and the wagon's team of 4 horses, which she had quietly hitched while the men were distracted, were stamping, ready to run. "Get on!" she screamed. Rourke appeared from the side of the warehouse, his face a mask of black, murderous rage. He saw them, He saw his boss's wagon. He raised his rifle. Tilda didn't wait. She cracked the heavy freight whip over the horses' heads. The crack was as loud as a gunshot. The 4 horses lunged, the wagon lurching forward with a groan. "Get him!" Pike screamed, running from the office, his bag of silver in his hand. Rourke ran, not for the wagon, but for his own horse, tied to the rail. He was fast, faster than the wagon. He swung into the saddle, his rifle in his hand. "He'll cut us off," Holden yelled, climbing onto the back of the wagon, pulling Maeve up. "No, he won't!" Tilda cried. She wasn't steering for the road. She was steering straight for the horse trough. "Tilda, no!" Holden yelled. The girl did not flinch. She drove the team straight at the overflowing wellhead, the one Rourke was so afraid of. The ground around it was a soupy, deep mire. Rourke, riding hard, his eyes on the wagon, didn't see the mud until it was too late. His horse, running at a full gallop, hit the bog. The animal screamed, a terrible sound, as it sank to its hocks. Rourke was thrown, flying head over heels, landing face first in the thick, stinking mud. He was stuck. His horse was trapped, and the wagon was thundering away. As they hit the main road, the wagon rattling, their stolen evidence secure. Another sound carried on the wind, clear, urgent, and public. Dong, dong, dong. The bell, but it wasn't the church bell. It was the town hall bell, the one used for fires and emergencies. "What is that?" Maeve said, her hair flying, her face triumphant. "That," Holden said, a slow, admiring smile spreading across his face, "is Mrs. Alberta Klein. She's calling a public hearing, an emergency hearing." Back at the post, Orson Pike, covered in mud, his silver scattered, heard it too, and at that exact moment, a boy on a fast pony rode up, handing him a folded piece of paper. A summons. He was being compelled to appear at the emergency hearing, and he was. The summons read, "Required to bring all relevant cargo, specifically the crate marked PE for immediate inspection by the court." Pike looked at the summons. He looked at the fake invoice Maeve had left, the one with Quayle's name on it. He looked at his wagon, now just a crate of rocks. His trap was sprung. He had to go to the court with his proof to save his own skin. Night fell on Larkspur not as a blanket, but as a judgment. The air, washed clean by the storm, turned sharp and cold. The town, stunned by the day's events, had retreated indoors. The saloon was quiet. The streets were empty. Marshal Thorne, overwhelmed and understaffed, had a jail cell built for 2, which was now holding 3 Pike, Quayle, and a sputtering, muddy Caleb Rourke. But the marshal's victory had been short-lived. An hour after being locked up, Rourke was gone. The cell's back window, its bars rusted and loose, was empty. A deputy, new to his job, was nursing a lump on his head. Holden and Maeve, however, did not know this. Their battle was over, their evidence submitted, their wagon returned to Mrs. Klein. Their only remaining duty was to Tilda. "She has no one," Maeve had said, her voice flat, as they stood outside the now closed town hall. "She slept in the stable at the Dry Comet. She can't stay there." "I know a place," Holden said. "The Juniper Lantern. Mrs. Gable, the woman who runs it, is a decent soul. She'll take her in. I'll pay." They found Tilda by the wagon, patiently waiting, her mule tied to the back. She was small, a speck of dust in the twilight, but her spine was straight. The Juniper Lantern was at the end of the main street, a squat, 2-story building that smelled of baking bread and clean lye. It was the warmest place in town, and its heart was the kitchen. Mrs. Gable, a woman with a face as kind as it was weary, took one look at Tilda, at her thin frame and old new eyes, and simply nodded. "We'll find a cot," she said, her voice a low, warm hum. "There's fresh apple pie and hot milk in the kitchen. Go on, child. You're safe here." Tilda looked up at Maeve, her gaze searching. Maeve knelt, ignoring the weariness in her own bones, and put her hands on the girl's small shoulders. "You're safe," Maeve repeated, her voice a vow. "I will be back tomorrow, for your lesson." Tilda nodded, a small, jerky movement, and allowed Mrs. Gable to lead her inside, toward the light and the smell of cinnamon. Holden and Maeve stood on the porch, alone. The quiet was sudden, the absence of Tilda a strange, new void, the adrenaline of the day, the victory, the fear. It all receded, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. "Well," Holden said, his voice rough, "that's done." Maeve just nodded, her arms wrapping around herself. The street was dark. I should find a room." "And Mrs. Gable will have one," he said. They turned to walk back toward the main street, the alley that ran beside the boarding house. Gallows Alley was a shortcut. It was named for a hanging that had never happened, and it was a black, lightless cut between the buildings. "This way," Holden said, gesturing. "It's faster." They stepped out of the light of the boarding house porch and into the ink. The alley smelled of stale beer, damp earth, and wood smoke. They were halfway through when a shadow detached itself from a stack of barrels. "I figured you'd take her somewhere soft." Rourke's voice. It was not the voice of a man. It was a raw, wet, broken sound, a predator's growl. Holden reacted instantly. He shoved Maeve hard, pushing her toward the wall. As he drew his pistol, "Maeve, run!" But Rourke was not in front of them. He was on them. He had been on the roof of the shed. He dropped, not on Holden, but on Maeve. He hit her like a falling tree, his weight and rage carrying them both to the ground. Maeve cried out, a sharp sound of pain and surprise, her head hitting the hard-packed dirt. Holden spun, his pistol coming up, but it was too dark. He couldn't see. He couldn't get a shot without hitting her. "Rourke, get off her!" He lunged forward, using his ears, not his eyes. He heard the thud of a fist and Maeve's grunt. He tackled the writhing, dark shape. He connected with Rourke's shoulder, sending all three of them sprawling into a pile of discarded ropes and a broken crate. "I ain't here for you, rancher," Rourke snarled, his breath hot and sour. He was a wild thing. He was fighting for his life, his freedom, and he was fueled by a humiliation that had turned to poison. Holden felt a fist connect with his jaw, a flash of white-hot stars. His head snapped back, hitting the brick wall. He was dazed, the world tilting, his pistol skittering away into the darkness. Rourke was a phantom. He was on his feet. He had a rope in his hand, a heavy, thick lasso. He wasn't trying to kill Maeve. He was trying to take her. "You're my ticket," he hissed, his voice a strained whisper as he fumbled with the rope, trying to get it around Maeve's wrists. "You're my trade. I give them you. They let me go." Maeve was not a victim. She was not a prize. She kicked, her boot connecting with Rourke's knee. He howled, a short, sharp sound, and struck her, a backhanded blow that sent her reeling. Holden shook his head, the world swimming. He tried to stand, his legs like water. "Maeve!" Rourke saw him, saw his weakness. He turned from Maeve and lunged at Holden, sensing the easier kill. He brought the heavy, coiled rope down like a club, aiming for Holden's head. "No," Maeve's voice. It was not a plea, it was a command. Rourke's arm, in mid-swing, was caught. Not by Holden, by Maeve. She had not run. She had used the moment. She had grabbed a heavy wooden barrel stave from the broken crate. She didn't swing it. She jammed it, hard, into Rourke's side, below the ribs. A guide's move, a brawler's move. Rourke stopped, all the air leaving his body in a sudden, agonized woof. He dropped the rope, his hand going to his side. He turned, his eyes wide with surprise. "Bitch!" Maeve was already moving. She was inside his guard. She grabbed his outstretched arm with both hands, planted her foot, and used his own, lunging weight against him. It was a perfect, practiced lever. Rourke, for all his strength, was undone by physics. He flew over her hip, his body twisting, and crashed, back first, into the brick wall. His head hit the bricks with a sickening, hollow thud. He didn't get up, he just slid down, leaving a dark smear, and lay still, his breath a ragged, wet-sounding snore. Silence. The alley was profoundly, suddenly quiet. There was only the sound of Holden's ragged breathing, and Maeve's. "Is he?" Holden gasped, his hand on the wall, holding himself up. Maeve stood over the fallen man, her chest heaving. She was breathing, not in fear, but in rage. She picked up the rope Rourke had dropped. With quick, angry, efficient movements, she tied his hands, she tied his feet. She was not gentle. "He's breathing," she said, her voice a low, cold wire. She finished the knot, pulling it tight enough to cut. She knelt, her face inches from Rourke's. "Justice doesn't need your blood, Caleb," she whispered, her voice shaking with a contained, furious energy. "It just needs you to be alive to testify, to tell them every name, every dollar, every lie." She stood. She looked at Holden. She walked to him, her steps unsteady. "He hit you," she said, her voice suddenly small. He did," Holden said. He was leaning heavily against the wall. The world was still spinning. "He hit you, too." He tried to smile, but it was a pained grimace. Every time you save me, Maeve, what's the fee you're going to have to start charging me?" She looked at him, the man who had faced down Rourke's gun, the man who was now leaning, dazed, against a wall, trying to make a joke. He was a fool, and he was brave, and he was here. She didn't answer. She took a step, closing the small space between them. She reached up, her hand, the one with the bandaged wrist, and she touched his face. Her fingers were trembling. She traced the line of his jaw, where Rourke's fist had landed. "Maeve," he started to say. She silenced him. She stood on her toes, and she kissed him. It was not the kiss from the storm. That had been discovery. This was a statement. It was not the desperate, rain-soaked kiss of survivors. This was a kiss of choice. It was slow. It was deep. It was deliberate. It tasted of the cold night air and of the faint, lingering cinnamon from the boarding house kitchen, a scent that clung to her clothes. It was a kiss that said, "You are here. I am here. We are alive." He gasped, his hand, the one not braced against the wall, coming up to cover hers. He kissed her back, all the dazed confusion, all the fear, all the exhaustion, melting into this one, single, profound point of contact. She broke the kiss, but only by an inch. Her forehead rested against his, their breath, warm and white, mingled in the cold. "The fee," she whispered, her voice a vibration against his lips. "The fee is that you stay." He said nothing. He couldn't. He just pulled her in, his arms wrapping around her, holding her so tight he was afraid he might break her. But he couldn't stop. She melted against him, her own arms circling his waist, her face buried in the rough wool of his duster. They just stood there, in the mouth of the dark alley, holding each other up. The sound of Rourke's breathing was a distant, unimportant noise. Behind them, in the juniper lantern, a curtain in a second-floor window moved. Tilda May, who had been unable to sleep, who had been watching the street, had seen it all. She had seen the shadows fight. She had seen Rourke fall. And she saw them now, Maeve and Holden, not as heroes, but as two people, finding their balance. A small, wise smile touched her face. She reached out and quietly, carefully, pulled the curtain closed, giving them their moment. Holden and Maeve stood by the window of the boarding house parlor. An hour later, Rourke was back in a cell, this time under a guard of 3 armed, angry, and deeply embarrassed deputies. The town was, finally, safe. They stood, not touching, but close, the heat from their bodies near enough to feel. A single oil lamp burned on the table, its light a small, golden star, reflecting in the dark glass. The window was fogged with their breath. "Tomorrow," Maeve whispered, her voice quiet, her gaze on the dark street. "Tomorrow, I go back. I help Samuel Green. I help the others. We get the water flowing right." She paused. "And I get my name back." Holden looked at her profile in the lamplight. He saw the strength. He saw the scars. He saw the woman who had fought a railroad, a killer, and a corrupt judge, and won. He reached out, not to hold her, but just to touch. His fingers found hers, lacing through them. Her hand was cold. His was warm. "Maeve," he said, his voice low and steady. Your name was never lost." Far in the distance, a sound carried on the night air. A high, lonely, mournful sound. The whistle of the night train, the 10:15 passing through the territory. It was a sound of engines and industry, and a future that was always pushing forward, whether you were ready for it or not. Maeve's hand tightened on his. 1 week later, the water came. It did not come as a flood, or as a miracle. It came as a right. At the Larkspur Dam, the farmers of the valley gathered, not with rifles, but with tools. Holden Vance, his shoulder to the heavy, long-disused wooden sluice gate, pushed it open. For a moment, there was only the sound of grinding wood, then a gurgle, and then a clear, cold, rushing sound. The water, bright and clean as a polished mirror, poured into the old irrigation ditch. Samuel Green, his face a mask of disbelief, knelt and scooped a handful, letting it run through his fingers. He did not cheer. He wept. On the main post of the town hall, a new, permanent notice was nailed, its ink black and official, signed by a new, federally appointed marshal from Cheyenne. It was a notice confirming the public water rights of the Larkspur Valley, in perpetuity. The paper, a simple, legal document, was more powerful than any gun. The law, once it had started to move, had moved with the speed and finality of a rock slide. Judge Merritt Quayle was escorted from Ash Hollow in handcuffs, his face a waxy, defeated gray. His name, and the name of the Hummingbird Trust, became the first link in a long chain. Rourke, in a cell, with no hope of escape, had talked. He sang, a long, ugly song of names, dates, and payments. Pike, his silver confiscated, his bravado gone, had corroborated everything. His confession a desperate, sniveling plea for mercy. The chain of rust, the one that led all the way to an office in San Francisco, had been exposed. And at the dusty, forgotten crossroads of the Silver Wastes, a change had occurred that was just as profound. The old, splintered sign that had read Dry Comet Trading Post was gone. In its place, a new, cleanly painted board hung, its letters black and proud. Comet Station, fair trade, no humans. The place was no longer a fortress. It was a school. Under the wide porch, where armed men had once lounged, a line of children sat on a new wooden bench. Tilda May, her hair clean, her face bright, sat at the head of the line, a book in her lap. She was not just a student, she was the assistant teacher, and she drew a real silver salary for her work. Maeve Calder stood in front of them, a piece of white chalk in her hand. a large slate propped against the wall. She was teaching them their letters. A for apple, B for brave, W for water. Her voice, once a blade, was now a guide, patient and clear. In the corral, Holden Vance was finishing his work. He had rebuilt the broken stables, the wood new and smelling of pine. He was not just mending, he was building. And in the center of the yard, he had just finished lining a new, deep, hand-dug well. A backup well. A well not to be hoarded, but to be shared. It was an act of faith, a promise in stone and water. As the sun began to dip, painting the high clouds in strokes of fire red and apricot, Maeve finished the lesson. She dismissed the children, their laughter a new, strange, beautiful sound in this place that had only known silence and wind. She walked from the porch, not toward the house, but toward the ridge, the one that overlooked the vast canyon. In her hand, she carried something, a piece of iron, heavy and black. It was the bolt, the thick, crude iron bar that Pike had used to lock her in, to lock her away in the dark. She had found it in the mud. Left behind, she had kept it. She stood at the edge of the cliff, the wind pulling at her hair. She looked at the heavy bar. She felt its weight. It was the weight of her captivity, the weight of the lie, the weight of the woman she had been. She drew her arm back, her muscles coiling, and with a grunt that came from the deepest part of her, she threw it. The iron bar flew, end over end, a black slash against the burning sky. It did not make a grand sound. It disappeared into the canyon, and seconds later, a faint, distant clink, clatter, thud, echoed up, the sound of an ending. She stood, breathing, her hand still open. A horse's nicker sounded behind her. Holden. He was there, on his bay mare, and he was leading her horse. He did not speak. He did not need to. They rode up the high trail, past the mining station, past the dry arroyo, to the place they called Blazing Grass Point. The storm-washed air was so clear they could see, or thought they could, for 100 miles. The sky was not a ceiling. It was a promise, a vast, open, borderless thing. The wind was cold and tasted of salt, of distance. Holden dismounted and stood, looking out over the world. Maeve slid from her own horse and came to stand beside him. They were two small, dark figures against an infinite, red-gold backdrop. He looked at her. He saw the woman from the storm, the woman from the alley, the woman who had thrown a piece of her past into a canyon. He held out his hand. It was not a gesture of possession. It was not a hand to pull her up, or to hold her back. It was a hand offered, palm up, to be taken, a hand to walk beside, to stand beside. Maeve looked at his hand, the one she had seen mend a harness, the one she had seen clean her wounds, the one she had seen steady a gun. She saw the calluses. She saw the strength. She saw the promise. She placed her own hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid. She looked up at him, and she smiled. It was not the tight, pained smile of the survivor. It was a real smile, one that started in her eyes and lit her whole face. It was the smile of a person who had chosen, finally, to live. He drew her in, and he kissed her. It was their third kiss. It was not the tentative discovery in the storm. It was not the desperate, claiming kiss in the dark alley. This kiss was certain. It was warm. It was slow. It was the kiss of two people who had seen the worst of each other, and the worst of the world, and had chosen to stand together anyway. It was a kiss that tasted like the clean, cold air, and like a future. It was a long, slow, affirming kiss that ended, not with a break, but with a softening. They stood, foreheads touching, their hands still linked. "They'll be back, you know," Maeve whispered, her voice a low murmur against the wind. "The railroad. They don't give up. They'll come back with a different name." Holden nodded. He looked out at the vast, darkening horizon. Then we'll be here. He turned his gaze back to her, his eyes steady, his promise absolute. And we will call the truth by its name, only we'll say it louder. From the station far below, a sound drifted up on the wind. It was the sound of Tilda May, laughing. A high, clear, ringing sound. The sound of a life that was just beginning, written in fresh white chalk on a clean black slate. "I'd rather die," Maeve had said, her voice ablaze behind a locked door. The words that had been a cell, a final, desperate refusal. They were, she realized, a password. They were the key. Not to dying, but to living, finally, on her own terms. Thank you for listening to this story. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. To connect and share your thoughts, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give your support by hitting that hype button so more people can hear this tale.